Good morning. My name is Joanna Madalińska-Michalak. I work at the University of Warsaw, and today it's my privilege and pleasure that I can introduce our keynote speaker, Jorunn Møller. Møller is based at the University of Oslo, Norway, and through her leadership of research project, her work on research journals, and her development on international networks, Jorunn has made a significant contribution to our understanding of educational leadership and governance. Jorunn has contributed to the very important OECD project, and probably you know this project, Improving School Leadership and Leads Network, Leading Democratic Schools. This network was composed of social researchers who were interested in research on new public management in different European educational systems. Today, Jorunn will challenge our thinking about how educational leadership can address social justice. Jorunn, you are welcome.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for your kind word. And I would also like to thank the committee for inviting me to provide this keynote. So let me start with what is one of the most pressing concerns in education and educational research, the issue of inequality. Factors such as increased socioeconomic inequality, movement of people across national boundaries, and refugees creates major challenges for local communities and schools. And the concern is driven by increased awareness of achievement gaps across cultural groups. And also, we have received analysis of deficit thinking that permeates school policies intended to address these gaps. And as such, it is crucial to ensure that teaching and leadership are informed by the best available knowledge to meet these challenges. This presentation aims to explore what type of knowledge is used and given priority when politicians and administrators make decisions about improving education, and also to discuss what we need to know to address equity-relevant progress and improvement. And I will draw upon research on school leadership and school reform in which I have been involved. So, we all know that school leadership has become the priority in education policy around the globe. Therefore, in my first part of the presentation, I will discuss how research on school leadership is used in policy making, as well as the prominent position the OECD has in setting and defining the agenda both for leadership research and educational research in general. And I will also comment on the relevancy of research, in educational research. And in the second part, I will report some key findings based on a major research endeavor in which I have been involved since 2002, and the project known as the International Successful School Leadership or School Principalship Project, ISSPP, has developed an extensive body of research across more than 20 countries about the work of school leaders who are recognized as being successful. And then, in the third part, I will discuss these findings and point to some methodological shortcomings within research traditions on school leadership, in which the ISSPP might be positioned. And finally, I will suggest some implication and some steps forward. And a main argument I will put forward in this presentation is that our thinking about educational leadership in educational research needs to be complemented and informed by research which focuses on recent changes in the political economy and changes in school governance which have influenced being a principal and a teacher severely. So, first, to the role of OECD in setting the research agenda. Researchers have generally assumed that leaders at all levels of educational systems are essential for improving performance, school performance. But the key insight is that while leadership matters, it is best understood in context. In 2006, the OECD initiated the Improving School Leadership Project, in which 18 European countries and 4 countries outside Europe participated. And the aim was to provide policymakers with information to assist them in formulating and implementing policies leading to improved teaching and learning. And a main assumption was that successful school leadership was a key to improve educational outcomes. And in the reports in this project, and also in many national policy documents across the OECD countries, leadership is often portrayed as an unquestioned road to a promising future, but there are some if attached to it. So it's about if one is able to attract the right people to fill leadership position. If the core responsibilities are clearly defined and delimited. If school leaders are granted autonomy with appropriate support, if leadership is distributed, and if leadership development is treated as a continuum. And in addition, the OECD invited researchers, and myself included, to collect data and provide examples of best practice of systemic and innovative approaches to school leadership from 5 countries. And these sites were selected based on evidence, emerging evidence of positive results on international large-scale student assessment, like PISA, and also evidence of innovative models of distributing leadership, and evidence of promising practice of developing school leaders. So in many ways, the OECD recommendation based on this project have implied a resolute effort to provide higher degrees of autonomy and to shift the organizational metaphors of schools from hierarchical bureaucracies to an image of communities of practice. where professionals are in constant interaction. But it might be seen as a paradox that the OECD recommendation and models of best practice circulate alongside another discourse of new public management. And this is also supported by the OECD. And it implies more external control of schools and teachers' work. And I will argue that within these OECD reports, it is not acknowledged that seemingly politically neutral models of best practice are still politicized. No solid critique of the current climate of performative accountability is evident, and the power structure within which we all work are not problematized. Therefore, I think it is appropriate to ask if OECD's recommendations are deceptively presented in depoliticized terms. And this is particularly the case with anything that carries with it a social justice-oriented intent, because it is quite politically charged, and because it typically requires a more redistributive or welfarist approach. And the Improving School Leadership project is closely connected to the OECD's benchmarking and efficiency studies, in which the world's school system have been held up and compared to a small band of top performers on international student assessments. And as we all know, in which Finland has been the winning team for more than a decade. And PISA is now embedded within the intergovernmental structure of the OECD, informing the work of the organization in a number of areas, as well as shaping performance and risk management inside national education system. In the annual publication, Education at a Glance, the need to adapt historical and cultural differences between countries is mentioned. And there are also mentioned some tensions involved with making the indicator as comparable as possible. But the OECD argues, however, that the analysis in this report can be used to assist governments in building more effective and equitable education. As such, in order to establish comparability between cases, differences between educational systems have been downplayed, because that's a prerequisite to importing best practices from very different systems. And although it is legitimate to measure and evaluate how well the schools are performing to inform education policy, numerous studies have demonstrated and exemplified how the OECD has enacted ideologies of technocratic rationality, causing countries with diverse traditions and cultures to assimilate their educational practice to apparently conclusive standards of technocratic rationality, economic competitiveness, and market growth, and also with a strong output control based on external accountability regimes. I think Lingard and colleagues describe this excellent when they call it a form of global panopticism, with the global eye functioning in a regulatory capacity across and within national states. And another concern highlighted by Caroline Schills last year at ECER is that such policy permits educators to focus on equality and uniformity to the exclusion of difference, equity, and social justice. The discussion about evidence-informed policy research is not new. For more than 20 years, a report published by OECD raised the issue underlying the discussion and identified weak links between research, policy, and innovation in education. 12 years later, the call for evidence-based policy research, or the What Works agenda, was reinforced within the report, Evidence in Education, Linking Research and Policy, and the argument was legitimated by the fact that countries expressed a concern with student outcomes and also dissatisfaction with education system. And although there was no agreement within OECD on where to draw the lines around what should count as evidence, in the report it was argued that identifying what works was crucial in educational policy making. And the best method for achieving this involved doing randomized controlled trials. Setting a standard for good educational practice was important to improve education. The report did not elaborate on what should count as knowledge of success for whom and under which conditions. But implicitly, it was about improving test scores in basic subjects for all children. And in a recent report, the OECD identified some challenges in evidence-based policy making. And these included non-use. Data is not collected or capacity is lacking to allow for its use. Misuse. Data is poorly collected, incorrectly interpreted, or does not provide answers to be useful for decision making. And the last point, abuse. Data are manipulated to yield more favorable results or results in unintended consequences as well as intended. Nevertheless, the OECD argues for more and better data about strategies to increase students' outcomes. But the question remains, does more and better data provide the knowledge we need in order to address equity-relevant improvement in education? And this leads us to the issue of relevancy in educational research. Relevance is difficult to define, in part because it's easier to recognize in retrospect than in prospect. Also, considering the wide array of actors involved in education, raises the question of relevance for whom and for what. Leadership, teaching, and learning in schools are highly contextualized in time and space. And what is helpful in attaining one goal may be harmful in attaining another. So this makes the relevance of research and claims about what works hard to establish. Different perspectives within the research community assert different approaches to make education more relevant for practice. And some scholars argue for a more clinical approach. Such an approach would involve a focus on theory-informed practice, an overlap of the roles of the researcher and the teachers, similar to medical researchers, and also active engagement with the object of study. Some has addressed the issue of relevancy from the position of action research, and another approach is design-based research, which collects knowledge about what to do or how to intervene when one encounters recognizable problems in one's work. And within this design mode, teachers, school leaders, and researchers can work together, try out activities, and carefully record how students respond. The aim is innovative interventions for solving complex problems. But others have emphasized that the different orientations of teachers and researchers should be dealt with not by combining the two into an overlapping role, but by promoting a fruitful dialogue between teachers and researchers. And within this position, researchers can offer a theoretical mirror that allows teachers to see what is unique and what is routine in their classroom setting, while teachers can provide professional problems to spur theory development. And both parts can gain from interaction and take advantage of the tension between the two modes of professional practice. Researchers have chosen different approaches and different emphasis, but all have agreed upon a need for a productive dialogue between researchers, practitioners, and policymakers. Such a dialogue about what counts as evidence to improve educational quality is, however, not as straightforward as it may seem, because the goals of educational organizations are both diverse and diffuse. Well-intentioned actions may inevitably lead to unintended as well as intended consequences. Clarifying the issues surrounding the relevance of education research is significant, but equally important is the need to problematize and discuss the research itself and the ends it serves. And we know that educational field is a plurality of people and interests, and it lacks a set of agreed disciplinary methodology and foundational claims. Research that addresses issue of social justice have tended to be less appealing among politicians compared to studies which provide hard science, statistics, and evidence about what works. Therefore, As Helen Gunther has emphasized, based on her study on education policy in England during New Labour governments from 1997 to 2007, it is important to raise questions like, what type of knowledge is used by politicians, and who are regarded as knowers, and why? One challenge is that educational leadership is a political issue within which struggles over competing versions of the successful schools are taking place. Leading change processes in education is complex, and neutral change agents do not exist, because educational change is first about power. It involves self-interest, and as Bourdieu has shown us, it is also very much culturally defined and class-based. David Berliner has labeled educational research as hard-to-do science because educational researchers do science under conditions that physical scientists find intolerable. And educational researchers must deal with local conditions that limit generalizations. The context effects are significant because students, teachers, and principals in schools are embedded in complex and changing networks of social interaction. And learning processes can never be completely controlled. Therefore, randomized controlled trials, which often are highlighted as the gold standard in research, are extremely challenging to do in schools, and particularly within the field of educational leadership. So, with issues of relevance in mind, I will now move to my second part of my presentation and present some of the key findings and contribution of the ISSPP, in which I have been involved for more than 10 years. So, this project has, over more than 10 years, constructed case studies of successful principals across more than 20 countries and provided accounts of thinking about leadership and achievements, and also cross-country analysis of what constitutes success in different contexts. And it is probably the most comprehensive international study of school leadership ever undertaken across Western countries, and it continues to include new countries in the research. The studies, under the leadership of Professor Christopher Day, have been guided by a framework sensitive to context. And in most instances, the schools were visited on many occasions, often over several years, allowing for longitudinal studies. And in defining success, the project included both improvement in student academic attainment and improvement regarding students' well-being, citizenship, and values. The research, which mainly included case studies constructed by the researchers based on interviews with principal, teachers, students, surveys, and some observation, has provided a window into the lived experiences of successful schools and successful principals. It has also offered a celebration of the sustained and hard work of school principals across many countries and the hope they bring for a better education for children and young people. And the goal of this study has not been to produce another decontextualized list of what successful school leaders should do, but to understand under which condition leadership is considered successful. And this is especially the case because some of the school principals interviewed in these studies were serving in high-stakes accountability regimes, like the English-speaking countries, and were influenced by the push to more market-oriented system of education, while others were located in low-stakes context influenced by a welfarist legacy, like the Nordic countries, which has emphasized education as public good. Still, the beliefs and values that shape educational vision as expressed by the participating principles have shown more similarities than differences. And although no magic formula for success has been found because leadership is best understood in context, in general, school principals leading successful schools look upon themselves as guardians of certain values that are now at risk around the globe. The research has also identified a repertoire of basic leadership practice across many schools. And evident in all stories, which are mainly based on self-reports, was an ethic of care. The narratives were characterized by school principals' passion for their school, a strong sense of moral purpose, for building relational trust, a focus on developing staff members, including themselves, and a strong commitment to promote social justice, equity, and excellence. Principals, as well as teachers in these schools, wanted to make a difference to the lives of children and young people. And telling their stories afforded the principals an occasion to enact their identity as school leader. It functioned as a tool of legitimation of action. And there was also a strong focus on the experience of marginalized groups and inequities in educational opportunities and outcomes in these stories. So in the case studies, the principles were portrayed as being action-oriented and transformative, committed and persistent, inclusive and democratic, relational and caring, reflective and oriented toward more social justice. As such, there are many similarities with themes which capture what has been described and theorized as leadership for social justice. It might be the case that some of these principles have major blind spots when they tell their stories in interviews, or they know what should be the correct answer. But within ISSPP, also teachers, students, and parents have been interviewed about how the principal is leading the school, and they have confirmed the principal's strong sense of moral purpose. However, terms like an ethical care, commitment to children, social justice are all very elusive constructs which are politically loaded and subject to numerous interpretations. And there is also vagueness about the nature of basic leadership practices. Although it's easy to agree that each of the basic practices is necessary to improve education, it's not always clear what it means in everyday practice. A practice like setting a direction, or improving organization, or building a safe learning environment will look different when leading multicultural, socio-economic, diverse schools compared to leading more homogeneous ones. Or it must look different when leading schools serving more challenging populations. Leadership is context-specific, and therefore it's so important to contextualize these leadership practices. But then it's also problematic to establish comparability between cases, in particularly when we only have the stories based on the school as a unit of analysis. So, in the next section of my presentation, I will identify some methodological shortcomings within this research so far, because the research is also developing. In line with Pat Thompson in her book, Heads on the Block, I will argue that the problem with the collected narratives is that they easily end up by being heroic tales of "I did it my way." Even though an important claim based on the studies is that leadership has greater influence when it is distributed, to some degree, this research has contributed to the tradition of equating leadership with the principle. And many of these principles may indeed be characterized as heroes in the way they challenge the status quo and fight for the best learning opportunities for their students, whatever the circumstances. But by itself, there is a risk of returning to the great man theories of leadership. And in addition, the research may be criticized for focusing too much on personal capacities, and hence obscuring the reality that the principle's work is embedded in wider social structure of power. There is no doubt that policymakers add an unnecessary pressure to the role of school principals, and the ISSPP has likewise demonstrated how the successful principals continually work hard to mediate government policy and external changes so that they are able to be integrated with the school values. But so far, the design of this research does not allow for critical analysis of the wider power structure and the political conditions of school leadership as I see it, because it mainly has the focus on leadership within the organization, and a critique of the performative accountability regime is more implicit than explicit. Therefore, to ensure that politicians and administrators are informed by the best available knowledge to meet challenges connected to the issue of inequality, I will argue it is important to complement, or should I say redesign, studies of school leadership to include a focus on changes in the political economy. How education systems in Western societies during the last 30 years have gone through major reforms influenced largely by new public management or new managerialist ideas, and how different layers of leadership influence what is done in the local school. It is crucial that politicians administrators, and researchers have a dialogue about the long-term effects of this policy for an education of all children. Because it's also a matter of safeguarding school principals and teachers' commitment to equity within a policy environment that increasingly requires performative accountability. It is about establishing sustaining environment for recruiting principals and teachers. Because we know increasingly countries are facing huge recruitment problems. So, an alternative is to study educational leadership through the lenses of critical educational policy, where power is a starting point for any investigation into school leadership. And such lenses enable a focus on research that locates professional work and organizational development within power structures. And investigation also on how to transform these structures to address the issue of social inequality. But we do have a problem because politicians might have high ambition to use empirical research as the basis for policy making. But the tempo of policy making and the tempo of empirical research are not well adjusted to each other. Policymakers might expect research to provide answers and not problematize a complex context. So often they regard educational research findings as ambiguous, conflicting, insignificant, untimely, and only partially relevant. And this is particularly the case of research which is anchored in critical theories. And in line with Rick Mintrop, I would also argue that addressing power structures may cause discomfort for those in power, as well as political conflicts with those who have benefited from inequities. So based on the research agenda set or defined by the OECD, we know that some research knowledge has been celebrated by policymakers and administrators, while research which problematizes power has often been marginalized. And although models of distributed and shared leadership have gained terrain in research like the ISSPP and also in policy documents, I will argue that the models are usually decontextualized and they rarely address political and normative dimension of this type of work. As a result, they leave school leaders vulnerable to believing that they are engaging power issues when they are not, if they follow the prescriptions. We also know, based on the research within the network of leading democratic schools, that school principals have increasingly been experiencing a work environment in which contracting, outsourcing, public relations, and benchmarking test scores have taken center stage. So across countries in Europe, we have learned that school leaders' time has been characterized by unpredictability, loss of lots of uncertainty, deregulation, and managerial accountability, leading to an environment where economic interests or efficiency demands have often overshadowed collective and public interest. Standards have become almost a mantra for school reformers, and many countries have experienced an increasing trend toward developing a culture of performativity, and new public management reforms have distracted attention away from issues of equity. And across countries, much faith is put in assessment tools that provide data and information